Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today is Tuesday, and so we have Mr. Hershey Dwoskin within the headlines on Tuesdays. Please save your questions and welcome back. I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I thought long and hard about what to speak about today. And it's just, watching the news and the headlines and reading the newspapers and magazines, you just cannot avoid the changeover in the United States. So I thought I would speak about all the different things that Trump has managed to do or not do in his first 3 weeks in office. Remember, he only took power January the 20th. So we're not even a month in, and he's changed so much. But before we get to that, I'd like to explain again what the philosophy of the American leadership was when it was set up. What were the problems that they were trying to solve, and what were the conditions that they were trying to put on. And I'm going to remind everyone again that when America set up its constitution in the late 1700s, there were no models, there were no examples of what they could copy or what they could use. So everything they did, they made up from the beginning. And needless to say, of course, the founders of the country and the people who wrote the Constitution, many of them had different and even opposing ideas of how the state should be run. So whatever they came up with, in a certain sense, was a kind of a compromise between those who wanted the executive, meaning the president, to have a lot of power, those who wanted the executive to have no power, those who wanted the states to have all the power, those who wanted the federal government to have all the power, those who wanted to have as little taxation as possible, and those who wanted to have more taxation to pay for more of a role in the government. So the whole Constitution revolved around these, we'll call them practical issues. And then they also were inspired by writers of the French Revolution who decided on a kind of a universal declaration of the rights of man, so that the ideals of the French Revolution in some way or other were incorporated into the United States Constitution, especially as regards the freedom of conscience, the absence of an established religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. All of these things were ideals that were set out by the philosophers who inspired the French Revolution. And there were very close ties between France and the US at that time. And so a lot of these ideas got passed over to the American framers of the Constitution. In the main, the people who wrote that Constitution were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, John Adams, Hamilton, all of whom had specific roles and did certain jobs in preparing that Constitution. What they came up with was, a certain sense, a kind of a compromise. And the ideas that they were there were two kind of main themes of what they were trying to accomplish. One was that the leader of the country should not have absolute power, that the leader of the country could not be a king like their previous King George, who imposed his will without any opposition or without any comeback. So the idea was that the leader of the country would have to in some way be limited, his powers be limited. The second idea was that although people should have the right to choose their leadership, they wanted that choice to be guided. It couldn't be kind of an open choice, pick anybody you want, because the fear was that suppose they picked the wrong person and that person would cause damage to the country. How could the country stop that damage from happening? So, and especially what they were concerned about was that a politician who could be elected, who would decide to spend a lot of money which was raised from rich people to be spent on poor people. So they didn't want this whole idea of, we'll call it a whole community welfare or a national welfare, whereby the rich people, the landowners, the business people, the bankers would end up paying all the taxes, and all that money would end up in the pockets of poor people. So, this idea of a mob or mob rule was something that they tried to protect against. So how did they do that? The formula that they came up with is called separation of powers. And separation of powers means that they divided the executive branch from the legislative branch. So that was the first decision. So the executive branch means the president's cabinet, and their job is to be the overall leader of the country, to be the leader of the country in all the senses that means. The legislative branch is the branch that made the laws. So the laws are things that would have to bind the leader to follow what the laws are. And this legislative branch was divided, as we all know, into the Senate and the House of Representatives, each of which had different jobs. The job of the House of Representatives, which was the body closest to the people, the body elected every 2 years, this job was to spend money, to raise money, to deal with anything to do with money. For example, tariffs. Would be a job for the House of Representatives to enact. So any money spent by the United States government must start off by being passed in the House of Representatives. Then it goes to the Senate. The Senate's job was one of a wider scope, which was to look after all kinds of things like security, international relations, treaties, appointing judges, dealing with other important matters that would be of more of national interest than of local interest. So that was the job of the Senate. And a bill could only become law if the Senate and the House of Representatives and the President all signed the same bill. So where was the control on the President? The control on the President was that if the President wanted something, and the Senate and the House didn't want to spend the money for it, then he couldn't do it. He might have some sort of temporary powers, but not ones that would make for any really strong changes, because those changes would have to be agreed upon by the Congress, meaning the Senate and the House of Representatives, the elected officials. Of course, the president himself was also elected. Now, the third body, so the third balance, so after the executive and the legislative comes the judiciary. So the judiciary, meaning at the top, the Supreme Court, and of course, lower down the state courts and the district courts, they had the last say in interpreting the Constitution. So that if the government, meaning the legislative branch and the executive branch, both agreed on something, but that something went against the Constitution, the Supreme Court could eventually annul the law and cancel the case, because they could say it's our job in the end to uphold the Constitution. And pretty well, by precedent, by custom, the president and the legislature would have to defer to what the Supreme Court said. Otherwise, kind of, what's the point of having a Supreme Court? So this balance has, of course, its advantages and disadvantages, in that the disadvantages are that it takes longer to get something done. The advantages are that the needle cannot swing too much in either direction, because one aspect of this three-party rule would object to it, and then they wouldn't be able to go through with it. So this is kind of a general introduction to how the United States is set up. And of course, keep in mind all what's going on today with what I just finished saying. Now let's look at something else. Let's look at when a regime changes, when one party takes over from another party, whether it's on the state level or on the presidential level, what's normal and what's not normal. So it's normal that the new incoming administration can name all its officials, meaning, like in our sense in Canada, the cabinet. So all the cabinet ministers, or as they call them in the United States, the secretaries, Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Health, Secretary of Agriculture, all these jobs are cabinet level jobs. None of these people are elected in the way our system works, but they are appointed by the president. And inevitably, when a new administration comes in, all the people who were there before lose their jobs, and new ones are all nominated by the president. And it's not just that level, but several levels going down. It's normal that a couple of hundred people are changed over by the new administration in order to agree with and to fulfill the new administration's plans and priorities. So all that is normal. Now, what's a bit abnormal in this case is that the kind of people that Trump nominated for some of his jobs were really, we'll call it, outside of the mainstream. So, for example, Matt Gaetz and Peter Hesketh and Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy, all of these people have had either zero experience or zero personal credibilities or personal baggage which would disqualify a normal candidate. But at the same time, of course, President Trump came in and said, I want to turn over Washington. I want to make a revolution. I want to get rid of what he called the rot and the scandal in Washington. And words like this are not uncommon for presidents who take over from previous presidents. It's the degree that he's pressed his will that's unusual. President Trump has legitimacy in the sense that he won the popular vote. He won more votes than the Democrats. And of course, he won the electoral vote, meaning the majority of states with the most votes, he won them over. So it was, in a certain sense, a double victory, the same way as Biden had won the previous election. And he did not hide his ambitions, and he did not hide his program of how much he wanted to change Washington, to get rid of what he called the deep state, to get rid of what he called the politicization of the justice system, to get rid of many different aspects of government and to change them over. So all of this was no surprise. And yet, if we look at what's going on and we read the papers and we watch TV, we all say, how could he do that? You know, like, how come he's doing that? And yet we all knew that that's kind of what he wanted to do. And so we'll bring up lots of different examples of what he's done so far in the last few days, last 2.5 weeks. And we can divide these actions into several different categories. So one category I would call symbolic, or symbolic is a good word. So what would be some of the symbolic changes that he's made? First of all, to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Now, it's really a revolutionary change, since the name Gulf of Mexico has been used since 300 or 400 years, since Mexico was first founded and administered by Spain. Remember that in those days, in the olden days, Spain controlled not just what we call today Mexico, but Texas, even Louisiana at a certain point, Florida at a certain point. So in a certain sense, that whole Gulf of Mexico region, almost all of it was at one point or other controlled by Spain. And therefore, you could say it made sense for that Gulf to be called Gulf of Mexico. Since the 1840s, when Texas became a part of the United States, the border was set where it is. And sort of the northern half of the Gulf of Mexico is borders on the US. And the southern half, the eastern half and the southern half border, the western half and the southern half border on Mexico. But still, that name Gulf of Mexico was never, there was never an issue in the US to say, let's change the name. He just decided to change it, just as part of his nationalistic, populistic program. Well, what happens when the same place is called by two different names? Because Mexico said they're not changing how they call the Gulf of Mexico. And the United States ordered all mapping agencies to change the name. So what I was reading today was that the Google and other, international mapping authorities said that anywhere in the US, they'll call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. In Mexico, they'll call it the Gulf of Mexico. And for maps for use everywhere around the world, they'll just put both names on. So that way we have confusion on top of confusion. Just to mention that in the Middle East, the Iranians call the Persian Gulf the Persian Gulf. The Western world also calls it the Persian Gulf, but the Arab world calls it the Arab Gulf. So naming places is certainly a tactic or a tool in asserting authority over that place. And, that we'll call it, that practice has been going on, since the Romans and, if not before. We certainly know that in our own experience in Montreal between Dorchester, Maplewood, and countless other street names and town names that have been changed. So that's one change, Gulf of Mexico. How about the next one that he decided on? Renaming Mount Denali to changing the name back to Mount McKinley. President McKinley was a president at the turn of the 20th century. He was assassinated in 1901. He was extremely unpopular with liberal forces, and that's what made Trump like him so much. He believes that changing names is a sign of political correctness. And the name Denali was decided on by just I believe it's Barack Obama's time, to honor the native Alaskans who had always lived there and who had always called that mountain Denali. We have similar issues of naming going on now. People in Canada are also getting frustrated, we'll call it, by the overuse of changing of names. My brother, who works in Carleton University in Ottawa, has said all of their buildings have been changed to Indigenous names, which no one can pronounce and no one can remember. So, I would say there's a certain disadvantage in taking things too far, but changing the names for reasonable political reasons are good ideas. And certainly the change of Mount Denali from Mount McKinley was voted on not only by the whole Congress, but by Alaska, the Alaskan legislature itself. So it wasn't something imposed on America or imposed on Alaskans, but it was a popular change all around. We'll see what happens next time around. The next president can just decide, hey, we're going to change it back to Mount Denali, because if he could make one change, the next guy can make a different change. And then, you have this back and forth business. There was several other name changes were decided during the Biden administration, which was that the American military bases especially the ones in the South, should not be named after Confederate soldiers or generals. And the reasoning of this was twofold. One was, of course, that since the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Black Americans became much more prominent in politics and in society. And they resented the idea that a base that they would be serving on, and of course, Blacks serve in the US Armed Forces at a higher percentage than their percentage in the population, which is 14%, by the way. That why should they be serving in a military base named after a Confederate general whose job was to keep them in slavery? And so, the logic was, let's change the name to something different. So Fort Bragg in North Carolina was changed to Fort Liberty. And in particular, this Mr. Bragg, Braxton Bragg, was a Confederate general who was a horrible general, a very unpopular person with all of his troops. Nobody had anything good to say about him. And that fort and several other ones were changed to non-Confederate names. Remember that the Confederacy itself was a rebellion against the United States. It was treason. It was trying to break up the country called the United States. So to honor generals who fought against the United States, in a certain sense, seems very illogical. And yet, of course, the reason for doing all that was that in order to reintegrate the Southern secessionist states into the United States, things had to be done to kind of make peace with them. And honoring their soldiers was one way to do this. Today, I was reading, I think it was today, that the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hesketh, who was confirmed on a 51-50 vote, he decided to rename Fort Bragg, except that he couldn't go ahead and say, I'm naming it after a Confederate general. So he looked up something in Army records to find another Bragg, a private, no less, whose name was Bragg. And he said, okay, we're going to name we're going to rename Fort Liberty, going back to Fort Bragg, but it's not really named after the Confederate general. It's named after this private. So in other words, he tried to do by stealth what he was embarrassed to do out in the open. But in any case, these are the type of powers that the executive has that don't have to be voted on by the legislature. And so it just gives you an idea how sincere the efforts are by this new administration to overturn things that were done in the name of civil rights, things that are done in the name of equality for all different peoples, of course, things that are done for gay rights, things that are done for all different kinds of minority rights. And this administration is not only against it philosophically, but they're ready to move on practical ways to show what their philosophy is. The main promises or main platforms that he had, so we'll talk a little bit about that, was to end the politicization of the Justice Department, because he felt that Trump felt he had won the 2020 election, the previous election. By mind, he knows he didn't win it, but he says he felt that he did win it, and all the prosecutions that happened after that on himself for trying to overturn the vote, on himself for trying to take documents home from the White House, on his followers for rioting in January 6th, trying to overturn the election. So he feels that all of these prosecutions were political. In fact, of course, there was a political element to them, but they were not prosecuting ideas, they were prosecuting actions that were illegal. Now, what he wants to do is to weaponize the Justice Department to go after the judges who decided against him and to go after the prosecutors who prosecuted him. So he's doing exactly what he says he didn't want the other side to do, which was to use the Justice Department as a tool for his own wishes rather than being a tool to administer justice on behalf of the whole country. Of course, we all know he pledged to deport illegal aliens or illegal migrants to the United States. And he says he wants to deport criminals. And a lot of people say, sure, there's nothing wrong with deporting criminals, because why should the society be at risk for actions that these criminals might take? You know, a famous case was the Lake and Riley case, where an illegal alien murdered this young woman I think it was in Georgia. You know, for him, this typified the reason why he wants to get rid of criminal aliens. But something that people have to understand is that he or his administration previous had made it a crime to cross the US border illegally, in other words, without authorization. So in other words, the moment you cross the US border, by definition, you're a criminal, even though you haven't done anything, you haven't robbed anybody, you haven't attacked anybody, you haven't sold any drugs, you haven't imported any drugs. All you've done is cross the border. So that makes you a criminal in the eye of the Justice Department of Mr. Trump. And therefore, every single migrant who lives in the United States who hasn't entered legally is a criminal. And we're talking about now somewhere between 11 and 13 million people. And his objective is to deport them. Now, you might have seen a headline where there are children of illegal aliens who, of course, are very upset and who are frightened and who don't want to go to school because they're afraid that if they're in school, either they could get picked up or, even worse, their parents could get picked up. And if they go back home, there'll be nobody left in their house. So they don't want to be separated from their parents. And, you know, depending on which state you're in, the state authorities, who are the ones responsible for education, are either cooperating with Mr. Trump or opposing him. And to me, it was shocking to hear that the Secretary of Education of Oklahoma said, oh, yes, we will cooperate with the administration to reveal any illegal migrants in our school system because we want them out. And, you know, obviously these children are innocent of anything. They didn't do anything. They didn't decide anything. Not only that, but it goes against the interests of schools to lose students because their funding and their grants are based on the number of students in every school. So it's a kind of a, we'll call it an adverse policy to try to help the administration to get rid of students from their schools. Not to speak of the tremendous harm on the economy that this would take by removing workers who are taxpayers and who are, you know, contributing to the workforce and you know, to keeping the unemployment rate as low as it is. Because if all these workers were gone, the unemployment rate would be so low that the wages demanded would be so high that companies would not be able to afford to pay and the economy would slow down. The other thing he promised to do, Trump, was, of course, to put tariffs on. And this changed. He got pushback really quickly from all kinds of stakeholders to say, hey, remember, tariffs are something that hurts you, the one who put the tariffs on, and not so much hurting the country that the tariffs are going on. It really hurts both countries. But if the other country retaliates and puts tariffs on American goods, well, then people who produce those goods and those workers also get hurt. And of course, the consumers end up paying more no matter which side the tariffs are on. So they'll pay more for imports because tariffs go into the cost of the price of something that's being imported. And the if they are and if prices start to go up, then inflation raises prices of everything, even though those items are not imported. So he has, up until now, up until yesterday, he has hesitated to put tariffs on the way he promised he would from day one. He did say he was putting tariffs on steel and aluminum. Also, something that was objected to so strongly by industries in the United States that use steel and aluminum, like the manufacturing industries, the car industries, the manufacturers of pipes, the natural gas industry, which uses tons of pipes, the construction and business, which uses tons of steel. All it means is that their costs will go up, the prices of houses will go up, and the prices of anything that has the materials in them will also go up. And needless to say, when other countries retaliate, America will be hurt as well. He also put a tariff of 10% on Chinese imports, which means that China is one of the biggest exporters to the U.S. So everything that is sent in from China gets taxed. Another interesting quirk, you might have heard about it or didn't hear about it, was there was always a policy in the United States that any package entering the U.S. that costs less than $800, that package would be free of tariffs or duties. And so Chinese companies like Shein and Temu would send clothes in small packages valued less than $800 coming into the US without duties. Trump decided to get rid of that loophole. And so what happened was that millions and millions of packages ended up lying in the post office that had to be gone through. And, there just isn't the workers to do that. And so he decided, okay, well, I guess that was a bad idea. I'm changing my mind. So it goes to show how little thought goes into the planning of some of these very important changes that he's decided to do. Now, the tariffs and the economy in general are really the purvey of the House of Representatives. And the reason how Trump has gotten around the jurisdiction of the House of Representatives is to say, well, it's a national emergency. And therefore, in a national emergency, I can do whatever I want. So it's a national emergency that other countries are sending steel into the US. It's a national emergency that Canada and Mexico in general have a trade surplus with the United States. And the moment this idea of national emergency is invoked, then he has powers, at least temporarily, to do whatever he wants. So all of this was thought out in advance by his team, by his administration, and all figured out so that everything was all ready for him to declare, to use these declarations, which are really meant for a real emergency. And because nothing happened any different from a month ago till now. So there is no national emergency. It's not like a war has broken out and there's a national emergency, or, for example, when COVID happened, that was a national emergency. But nothing happened, especially from a month ago till now. And yet, by declaring a national emergency, he can bypass the jurisdiction of the House of Representatives on all economic matters. And that he's done. He's also said he would want to get rid of the deep state. And by what he's decided to do, which is, again, extremely unusual, was at the end of things, we'll say, to fire every federal worker, except, of course, people in the military or people in the post office, and then to rehire them fewer of them, number one, and then to rehire only people who agreed with him, number two. So this is extremely, extremely unusual because, like I said at the very beginning, in the United States tradition, people who work for the government, and same thing in Canada, are not there as political appointees. They're there to serve the people of the country. They're there to serve the offices that they work for. And it's not normal to fire every single worker, and there are 2 million workers in the US who got notices, just at a change of government. It's normal to change over the top 100, 150, but not everybody. And yet, so there's a two-pronged strategy here. One is to try to save money by hiring back fewer workers. And the other one is to make sure that any workers who do come to work for the federal government are Trump supporters. And therefore, they won't do anything to stop his actions. Because in his last administration, from 2016 to 2020, there was a feeling that the whole federal civil service was working against him, which was partly true, to stop his more radical ideas and plans and programs from being carried out. And so he said, I learned my lesson from last time. This time what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer everybody an 8-month pay package. If you resign now, you will get 8 months pay. And in the 8 months time, you can go look for another job. And if you don't do that, then I can fire you at the end of 8 months. So obviously this struck fear in the hearts of the millions of federal civil servants. This goes against the law, by the way, because the law says that these people have a right to their jobs, and lawsuits were filed right away, and some of his actions were stopped by different judges in different parts of the United States. But it goes to show how radical transformation he wants to do. He put Elon Musk in charge of this DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, D-O-G-E. And as part of Elon Musk's actions, he's demanded all kinds of details, especially on pay, from all kinds of different government offices. Now, theoretically, this information is really secure and private, and it's not open to outsiders to look at. And so because of that complaint, Trump named Musk as an official government employee and named him as having the jurisdiction to do whatever he wants. So again, this is something far beyond the usual scope of changeover of administrations, and it remains to be seen how this will be fought out in court. One important point that I wanted to make was that, and to go back to the beginning where I said there was a separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary, was that the judiciary has the ultimate authority to render a decision whether something is illegal. But, and the but is, they have no real way of enforcing it. So if the court says that what Trump is doing with the staff of the federal government is illegal, he could say, I'm firing you anyway, and I don't care what the court says, and let the court be damned. And once that happens, and that is his attitude, once that happens, then the whole brick structure of the democracy is broken, because there isn't any more a separation of powers. It's just the president doing whatever he wants and either ignoring or defying the other two layers, which are supposed to be equal, the legislative layer and the judicial layer. And Trump looks like, and so far has looked like, he wants to do that. Now, I was reading about an interesting precedent to all of this, going back to Trump's favorite president, President Jackson, who did something kind of similar. So I'm going to just remind you that in the 1820s, the growth of the United States and the expansion of number of people in the country butted up against the native populations, especially in the southern US, meaning the tribes who lived in the southern United States, who had always lived there, found that white settlers were coming in and trying to take over their lands. And what happened was that the state of Georgia decided that all the Cherokee Nation, who were the population living in the northern and the northwestern part of the state, that all of these people had no longer any rights. They weren't citizens, and they should just get out and let the white people take over their territory. The native population went to the court to say, hey, this is illegal. And the court agreed with them. Now, what happened was that President Jackson, who agreed to kick out the natives, said, I don't care what the court says about Georgia, I'm kicking the natives out. And indeed, the entire almost 100% of all the indigenous people living in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, all of these people were forcibly marched to Oklahoma, where they were supposedly given a state of their own called Indian Territory. It wasn't a state, it was a territory. That was that. So in other words, on such an important issue, the authority of the court was defied by a president. And that's the reason why Jackson is Trump's favorite president. It's also the reason why people want Jackson's portrait to be removed from the $20 bill. And it was supposed to have been done, but if it was done, I'm sure Trump would be reversing it, right away. But that was the story of Andrew Jackson. The idea of canceling everything and only rebuilding from what's necessary was a way of getting, in Trump's eyes and of Musk's eyes, of getting rid of all the fat and bloat and extra personnel that have been added on bit by bit to the government. And as you probably could figure out, governments only get bigger, they rarely get smaller. And this is a way, sort of with one quick stroke, to start everything from the beginning. And Musk has done this, lots of times with some of his own companies and with other ones that he wanted to buy out. But we have to remember that government expenditures are mostly fixed. So the cost of Medicare, the cost of Social Security, the cost of pensions, the cost of interest, the cost of the civil service, the cost of the military, all of these things are pretty well fixed. And up until now, there wasn't anyone who could change that. The only thing they could change would be maybe the 10 to 20% of expenditures that are discretionary. But Trump has decided to even go after this 80 to 90%, which are fixed expenses. One of the first things that he decided to do was to go after certain departments that he really didn't like. So the Department of US aid, giving foreign aid to foreign countries, he felt is just a pure waste of money. And there is no question that some of this aid that was going to foreign countries was not going in the right way. In other words, some of it gets siphoned off. Some of it was used as maybe bribes to leaders of countries to do certain things. But most of it, and a lot of it, was spent in the United States itself. So it wasn't as if the US was handing out, billions of dollars to foreign countries without any thing coming back in return. The return of giving aid to foreign countries is to build goodwill from those countries to the United States, to make friends in those countries, to spend the money in the US on supplies that are given, especially agricultural supplies given to these foreign countries. And lastly, just for the good-heartedness of helping people who are much, much more unfortunate than you are. The hope being, of course, that when these people do get to raise their standard of living, they themselves will be able to afford to buy American goods. So there's lots of reasons for giving foreign aid, which benefit the donor. And many, many countries in the world abide by this. Some of them give a bigger percentage of their income than others. But one way or another, most of the wealthy countries in the world, and even the medium level countries like China, do give foreign aid with all kinds of expectations in return. It seems as if President Trump believes that there's nothing to be expected in return from giving other people American money. So he canceled that right off the bat. He closed the offices, told people not to show up to work, took away their computers, and to do something like that suddenly, and the foreign aid represents less than 1% of the budget of the United States. To do it so quickly means that there were goods being shipped in the middle of shipment between, say, the United States and Africa. Nobody knows what's going to happen to those goods. Things were ordered and not paid for. And then what happens to the payment for those things? Staff was told to go certain places, and now they're stuck in the middle of nowhere. And so to do everything just like that is an extremely poor way of planning. And it's in a certain sense of a very vindictive way of doing business. And that's what Trump is all about, is vindictiveness. The Consumer Protection Bureau was told to stop protecting consumers. Now, what's the role of the Consumer Protection Bureau? It's to keep an eye on banks, to keep an eye on scammy behavior, to protect consumers. And he immediately shut that office down. You have to remember that Trump himself was a scammer. He started something called Trump University, which was proved to be a scam from start to finish. Told students enrolling there for big dollars that they would have all kinds of great futures if they did that, and of course, didn't happen. There was no quality to that so-called university whatsoever, and many other promotions that he did in his personal life also turned out to be scams. So, to stop the Consumer Protection Bureau is almost in a certain sense a conflict of interest, because Trump was the one who was taking advantage of consumers. Like I was just reading about the item I was talking about before, the foreign aid, that there's $500 million worth of goods that are stuck in ports. And if these goods are not distributed to the poor countries that are supposed to go to, they'll end up getting stolen, or the goods will end up getting spoiled in the case of food. And it's a huge waste of money that he's decided to do. I'm just looking at some of my notes. Oh yes, he's deactivated some of the more important government agencies, the ones that deal with the environment, the ones who deal with the state of nature of the United States, because he's always felt that protecting nature is not an important priority, because this goes against the interests of miners, this goes against the interests of oil producers, goes against the interests of gas producers, goes against the interests of manufacturing, who might be polluting waterways, but the fact is they're manufacturers. So in his sense, protecting nature goes against the goal of his to promote manufacturing, mining, etc. at any cost. So any environmental protection agency was closed down. the national NCOA, National Atmospheric atmospheric organization, the ones that look at the air quality, also was closed down. Of course, any programs having to do with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, anything to do with protecting gay rights, any of that kind of stuff, so-called wokeness, all of those agencies were also immediately shut down. Some of his other ideas were good ones. He ended production of 1-cent coins. We did that in Canada a long time ago because it cost 4 cents to produce 1 cent, and that 1 cent doesn't buy anything anyways. In general, coins are used so much less than they used to be. Vending machines have now switched to using credit cards, and so ending the production of a 1-cent coin is a great idea. And they should be, some people say they should end the 5-cent coin as well. So that was a good idea. One of his other declarative ideas was to end the ban on plastic straws. You might have heard of that because it was done in the name of the environment to stop plastic getting into the waste system. But Trump hates environmentalism, and so and he says paper straws don't work. And so he said there's no more ban on the use of plastic straws. Another one of his interesting ideas was, and again, think of this in racial terms, was to help South African white people to come to the United States if necessary, because of laws that the South African government put into effect against land confiscation without compensation. So when South Africa transformed itself into a majority-run country, the white population at that time was somewhere around 15%. Today it's around 10%. But this minority of white people owned 80% of the land. And how they ended up owning all that land was they simply took it from the Black inhabitants when either the Dutch administration or the British administration took over the territories, which are now South Africa. So the Black people were never compensated for the land that they were driven off of, and that's how the white farmers became well off, and that's how the white population in general became well off. When South Africa moved to majority rule, they put into effect a stipulation that said that, first of all, what they said is that white people who wanted to get rid of their lands, those lands would be bought by the government for distribution to the Black population. And they put out a possibility which was not enacted on. It was, in other words, the law was passed but not enacted to say that the government had the right to unilaterally expropriate white farms, where those farms could not be shown that they were actually bought from somebody who had the right to that title. So this was something that was, I would call it a political declaration, but it was never acted on in South Africa. And yet Elon Musk, being South African and being a white and being right-wing and being even far right-wing in some senses, he felt that the white farmers in South Africa were being discriminated against. And he told President Trump to end all aid to South Africa unless this law was canceled, and to end all aid to South Africa if it could be shown that South Africa was discriminating against one group of people. Of course, under apartheid rule, which ended only in 1994, it was the law to discriminate against Black people who were the 80% majority in the country. So it's a funny, I mean, discrimination is not right in any sense, but the United States government was not prepared to welcome Black people from South Africa who were discriminated against. But now Elon Musk has convinced Trump to say, well, there aren't that many white South Africans, especially Afrikaners, who are the farming class in South Africa, and that these people should be allowed to come into the US. The odd part is that he's trying to keep everybody else out, but somehow or other, white Afrikaner people from South Africa should be allowed to come in. So you could see kind of where some of these political acts, where their inspiration comes from. Now, needless to say, some of his other crazy ideas, like taking over Panama, taking over Greenland, taking over Canada, these are all declarations that he's made, and of course, taking over the Gaza Strip. Although these declarations make headlines, they don't have the practical effect of some of the other things that I was mentioning before, the changes that he has made to the personnel and to the laws and to the tariffs and everything else. So you have some sort of aspirational ideas, and then you have some sort of practical plans and practical ideas, and the two don't necessarily match up with each other, even though the idea of taking over Gaza and building hotels makes big headlines. So far, the United States has done nothing practical about it. Now, if the United States were to say, okay, the 2 million Gazans are welcome to come into the US instead of the Afrikaners, and if they come into the US, we'll give them status and citizenship and residence, and we'll pay the money for their transfer. If he was going to do that, that would be definitely a historical move and a historical event. And I am positive, no matter what people in Gaza say, that their attachment to Gaza will last 5 seconds if Trump were to offer each of them a huge sum of money and the right to come live in the US. Because remember that up until now, Gazans were among the larger populations who were trying to get out of Gaza and to sneak into Europe via Egypt and via Lebanon and via Turkey, and many of whom were drowned in the ocean, in the Mediterranean, trying to make this a futile effort. So proclamations of Gaza will never leave our land. We're happy to live in tents. We're happy to live in terrible conditions. That's just for show. In what people say is one thing, and what they do is something else. And certainly, what they've done is trying to get out of Gaza. But Trump also does things for show, because if he was serious about getting Gazans out of there, he would say, "Okay, come to the U.S. and then we'll develop Gaza." So that's the end of that. And the same thing, I believe, so far with taking over Canada. I don't think he's done anything in the way to do that. What's odd is that the Gaza idea has gone farther than just a sort of a thought, because you know what, Trump thinks can sometimes go into one ear and come out the other. But he's already threatened Jordan and Egypt to say, if you don't take these Gazans, I'll stop funding you. And that's already taking a different step. That's already going one extra step. He hasn't said that he's willing to pay. He hasn't said that he's willing to use U.S. troops. Needless to say, the Arab states have not been happy about this, because they don't want to receive all these millions of people without resources and with grievances. And they also say that if the precedent is set that they could get rid of the Palestinians from Gaza, what's to stop Israel from kicking out the Palestinians who live in the West Bank of the Jordan, and then, of course, having a state all of their own without Arabs in it. And this is the last thing that the Palestinians, who theoretically have been living for 75 years without their own state. He's, we'll just have a look and see what other stuff he's done here. I mean, there's just so many things that we spoke about. Um, by the way, just to give you an idea, my time is getting close here. Of all the people that he's offered to quit their jobs in exchange for 8 months' pay, only 3% have taken him up on it. And the normal churn or the normal turnover of federal government workers is 7% a year. So he hasn't really achieved so far voluntarily, he hasn't achieved the results that he's been trying to do. I'm going to mention something else he's tried to do, which is again illegal, was to end birthright citizenship. So the idea that if you're born in the United States, you're an automatic American citizen. This idea goes back to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution after the Civil War, which gave Black people the right of citizenship, which they did not have before the Civil War. So the Constitution was amended to say that anybody living in the United States where the US has jurisdiction, if they're born in the US, they're automatically a citizen. So what does it mean by where the US has jurisdiction? So who was that meant to exclude? It was meant to exclude foreign soldiers on US soil. It was meant to exclude foreign diplomats on US soil. It was meant to exclude people who were just coming to visit temporarily and who are leaving the country. In other words, anybody who really was not part of the United States by wish, those people, like a foreign diplomat who's really a citizen of their own country, those people were excluded. But certainly migrants who came to the US to live there, their children being born there, were not excluded. And Trump is trying to overturn that. One judge already told him this is ridiculous and forget about it. But it just goes to show how he's willing to really break the law in order to get what he wants done, and hopefully to get it up to a Supreme Court where he's nominated three of the 9 judges to get them to agree with him. And then at the last instance, even if the judges don't agree with him, he would like to go ahead and do what he wants to do anyway. So it really is a kind of a revolution as far as the United States is concerned. And of course, he stopped all applications for refugee status. So in other words, the United States has a rule that says that refugees are allowed to apply for admission to the US. And what he's done is say, no, refugees are not allowed to apply anymore. So that's another big change. And he would like to use the IRS to find out where illegal immigrants are working, looking at payments made by employers. And he also wants to reduce the IRS agents who are busy auditing and finding tax fraud, because of course he himself is a fraud and a tax fraud. And he doesn't want the IRS looking at people like him, but he wants the IRS to look for illegal aliens. Remember that President Trump paid $750 total of federal taxes in many different tax years, using all kinds of tax dodges, legal and illegal. Let's see, are we up to date? I think that pretty well covers, the first 3 weeks of his administration. And if this keeps on 3 weeks by 3 weeks, I think there'll be unending amount of discussion that could be had. And, it's I would say the people who are put in the worst position are Republicans who were elected to the Senate and to the House of Representatives. Each body has their own powers, and to watch the president ride over those powers and being forced not to say anything, those are the people who are in the worst possible position. So I'm going to end it here, and I'm going to open up the floor and allow Maria to find any of you who has any comments or questions, and we'll see where it goes.
You may put questions in the chat or raise your hand. I guess as we wait,
Yeah,
was Melania Trump a citizen when Barron was born?
Melania Trump was actually, in a sense, working as a model, the word model with quotation marks around it, illegally, because she came to the United States on a tourist visa. And you're not allowed to work on a tourist visa, but she was a porn model and making money, making those kind of movies. And even more grating was that she did eventually get her green card, and then she got her citizenship. But her parents, who are Slovenians, she brought them over and got them citizenship, even though President Trump is against what he calls chain migration. In other words, if you allow one alien into the country, then they could bring their parents and it becomes a chain. And so he gave them citizenship, of course, just out of pure favoritism. And it goes against what his whole idea of chain migration. But somehow or other, her parents were able to get American citizenship. So yes, she did work illegally in the United States. That's the case, and she eventually got citizenship. The odd thing is that his first wife, Ivana, she was also a Czech person. Well, not also. I mean, she was also an alien who, for some reason or other, he was attracted to and married, and also got American citizenship. She lived in Canada. She lived in Montreal, actually, if I'm not mistaken, for part of her life.
Okay, we have someone who, oh, I don't know if we have time for this one. Please discuss the nuclear arms and regime in Iran.
Well, okay. A part of so both under we'll start like this. That since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iran was considered an enemy of the U.S. Remember that Iran seized the U.S. embassy when they took over after the revolution and held hostages all the people who were working there. So from the get-go, this regime has been an enemy of the United States. This regime is also, of course, an enemy of Israel. They vowed to destroy Israel and has developed nuclear weapons against or is developing nuclear weapons against the wishes of the rest of the world, has claimed that they weren't developing nuclear weapons, but they were enriching uranium in order to do medical research and in order to use nuclear power. Of course, a country as wealthy as Iran in oil doesn't really need nuclear power. Iran has the world's top five resources in gas and oil, and so reserves. I mean, not resources. Top five reserves in oil and gas. They don't really need nuclear for generating electricity. So there was a kind of an agreement made, especially by the European powers and Iran, that in exchange for Iran stopping their nuclear production, that the boycott of Iranian goods and the sanctions put on Iran would be taken off bit by bit. When Trump became president the first time, he said, no, I don't like this idea of rewarding Iran for doing bad things, and I'm just going to get out of it, and I'm not going to be part of it. So what happened ironically, of course, to Mr. Trump, is Iran said, well, okay, if the U.S. doesn't care what we do, we'll just make more nuclear, fuel, and we'll progress toward making a nuclear weapon because the U.S. has now washed its hands of us. So that really proved to be counterproductive. And the world has only so much that they can do to punish Iran for what they're doing, because Iran has really only one export, which is which is oil and gas. And they have willing buyers in China, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, and all kinds of other Asian countries that are buying this sanctioned oil at discount prices. And so the regime has been able to hold on based on this for so long. Of course, the standard of living has gone down, the value of their money has gone down to nothing. People are living in hardship, but it's not bad enough for people to want to overthrow the regime, which is willing to use all kinds of force to keep itself in power. So, you know, there's two ways to deal with something like this with a rogue regime. You could use a carrot or a stick. And Trump only believes in sticks, but he's not willing to use American sticks to overthrow the regime. So that's really where the situation is now as far as Iran is concerned. They suffered huge losses in Syria and in Lebanon with the destruction of the Syrian regime, with the destruction of the Hezbollah, and their other proxies in Yemen. The Houthis are being sort of neutralized bit by bit. So Iran's footprint around the world is not getting bigger, it's getting smaller. At a certain point, the regime will collapse, but no one really knows when. Yeah, anybody else?
I don't see any more questions. That was a big question.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess that's it for today. We'll see you
Okay.
again next week.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. And we'll see you all next Tuesday at 2 o'clock.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.